Alright guys, so I got a little bit of somewhat breaking news here for y'all because at the United Nations Security Council, Russia, China, and Algeria effectively just nuked the US proposal for a ceasefire in Gaza. And so I got this great article breaking down exactly what happened here from Trita Parsi of the Quincy Institute in Responsible Statecraft, and he's going to explain exactly why they voted against this. Now, before we get into this, I mean, my baseline read of this is basically that this was not actually a ceasefire resolution that was calling for an, unconditional immediate ceasefire in Gaza. And it had a lot of other weak points in it as well that we're going to get to here. But basically, it seems like this was an attempt from the Biden administration in order to deflect responsibility for, over the last 5 or 6 months now, being the primary opposition force at the United Nations Security Council, blockading any sort of past resolution to try to get an actual immediate ceasefire. And so let's just go ahead and get into some of the details here, because I think that a lot of the mainstream coverage that I've seen of this has been pretty misleading, but Trita does a great job here. He says, Russia and China just vetoed Biden's draft resolution on Gaza at the UN Security Council. Algeria also voted against it, though the resolution fell short of clearly demanding a ceasefire. So the language here is really important. So I want to focus on the language that he points out here, right? The resolution fell short of clearly demanding a ceasefire. Moscow and Beijing nevertheless enable Biden to shift the blame to Russia for the council's inaction, even though Biden has been the key obstacle to progress at the council for the last 6 months. First of all, this is significantly stronger than previous American drafts, yet it still falls short of a clear and unequivocal demand for an unconditional ceasefire. On the one hand, it no longer calls for a ceasefire as soon as practicable, as previous U.S. resolutions did, which was a remarkably weak formulation for obvious reasons, right? As soon as practicable, what does that mean? That's not an actual call for a ceasefire. That's just like, well, as soon as you guys get around to it, then maybe work towards a ceasefire, right? So this was a little bit stronger than previous iterations that were proposed by the US, but this one still has a lot of glaring flaws. They say, but the operative clause is still very convoluted and unnecessarily complicated, which has become the hallmark of everything Biden has done on Gaza. So, here from the Security Council, they say the UNSC determines the imperative of an immediate and sustained ceasefire to protect civilians on all sides, allow for the delivery of essential humanitarian assistance, and alleviate humanitarian suffering, and towards that end unequivocally supports ongoing international diplomatic efforts to secure such a ceasefire in connection with the release of the remaining hostages. Okay, so a couple of different things here. First off, determines the imperative of an immediate ceasefire. So this is different than other resolutions, which have used language like, we demand an immediate unconditional ceasefire. So this is saying we're determining the imperative. So like, we think a ceasefire is maybe kind of important, is what this is effectively saying. But then they also say that it unequivocally supports ongoing international diplomatic efforts to secure such a ceasefire. So keep in mind, guys, the Biden administration over the last number of weeks or months at this point has been coming out and calling for a ceasefire, and what they actually mean by this ceasefire is a temporary pause in the fighting during which there would be some sort of a deal that was worked out so that Hamas releases the hostages that they still have in their captivity back to Israel, and then after like roughly a 6-week period, Israel can go back into Gaza or continue with their offensive into Gaza. So the Biden, referencing of a ceasefire is basically just a temporary pause in the genocide. It's not an actual lasting ceasefire. And so during this resolution here, when they come out and they say that we're proposing a resolution so that the entirety of the UNSC will unequivocally support the Biden administration's approach to getting a ceasefire, a temporary ceasefire, what that basically says to me is that this is not actually a resolution that is calling for an immediate ceasefire. It's calling for an endorsement from the UNSC of Biden's approach to negotiating a potential future temporary ceasefire. So I know that the language is like kind of confusing here and it's convoluted in a way, but that's kind of intentional. But the reality of it is, again, exactly what I just described. This is effectively a UN resolution that is intended to just endorse what the Biden administration's approach to attempting to get a temporary ceasefire has been. Okay, I hope that that's kind of clear, because I know it's kind of confusing, but he continues here. He says the clause does not demand a ceasefire, but determines that it is imperative, whatever that means. They say its support is not directly for the ceasefire, but for the negotiation process that the U.S. has been co-leading and whose parameters the U.S. has sought to determine in favor of Israel. The text points out that this effort to secure a ceasefire is, quote, in connection with the release of all remaining hostages. They say this is an Israeli demand that is not likely to be accepted by Hamas in return for a time-limited ceasefire rather than a permanent one, and as such, the American draft endorses the Israeli position in the negotiations and indirectly conditions the ceasefire on the release of all hostages, effectively making 2 million Gazans hostage as well. Okay, and he's 100% correct. This paragraph basically summarizes everything that I was just saying, right? It's a time-limited ceasefire that the Biden administration is currently in the midst of trying to facilitate the negotiations on, and it's negotiations of which the parameters of he knows in the back of his mind Hamas is not likely to agree to. Because, I mean, think about this, guys. Regardless of your feelings of Hamas, I'm obviously not a fan of Hamas, but, you know, are they likely to accept a ceasefire proposal that includes the release of all of the hostages, which they should release the hostages, but let's think from a practical, strategic, perspective here. Is Hamas supposed to give up all of the hostages back to Israel in exchange for, like, what? A 6-week temporary ceasefire? So Hamas is required as a part of these negotiations to give up all of their leverage that they currently have, and then after 6 weeks, Israel continues in their campaign to eradicate Hamas. Does that seem, from a practical perspective, like something that Hamas would agree to? Doesn't seem like it. And so effectively what this boils down to is it looks like this is a resolution because it's endorsing Biden's negotiation strategy for a ceasefire, a temporary ceasefire. What this basically seems like is like a veiled excuse to allow Israel to continue with their offensive in Gaza. And so they continue. They say other operative clauses are stronger and more direct, although they still fall short of calling out Israel by names. And he gives a couple examples here, right? So, I mean, think about the fact, as we read through these, that they do not mention Israel by name. This is something that Guyana actually brought up during the hearings that I was listening to. And they brought up the fact that, like, they do not even really mention Israel as an operative actor in this situation. They do not put any blame on Israel for what is happening in Gaza. They don't attribute any sort of malfeasance to, Israel as the offensive actor in this situation. But, I mean, look at the language here. Rejecting any forced displacement of the civilian population of Gaza. Again, who is doing the displacing here? They don't mention Israel. They say demanding that Hamas and other armed groups immediately grant humanitarian access to all remaining hostages. Rejecting actions that reduce the territory of Gaza, including through the establishment of officially or unofficially called buffer zones, right, which we've covered before, condemning calls by government ministers for the resettlement of Gaza, and rejects any attempt at demographic or territorial change in Gaza. So how the fuck do you put forward a resolution that is condemning calls by government ministers for the resettlement of Gaza, but you don't mention Israel? Whose government ministers are calling to resettle Gaza? It's Israel, right? But they just somehow avoid that terminology there. It's amazing. He continues. He says, one crucial point, as UN journalist Rami Ayurahas, sorry if I'm butchering that name there, but he reported that the text has been weakened. Earlier drafts strongly opposed any Israeli attack on Rafah, but the current draft has watered down the language and moved it to a preamble, so not the operative part of this text, but the preamble part of this text in this resolution, and it's only expressing, quote, concern that a ground offensive into Rafah would result in further harm to civilians, instead of demanding that it be prevented. So you're not demanding Israel not go into Rafah and dramatically worsen the humanitarian crisis on the ground. You're just saying we're concerned about it. So what the fuck does that mean? Nothing. It means we're concerned about it. Okay, good for you. That has no binding aspect to it. If you're demanding Israel not go into Rafah, then you could potentially be talking about applying legitimate pressure there on Israel if this resolution was passed. But showing concern, what the hell does that mean? Who cares if you're showing concern about the Israeli genocide on Gaza? What matters is actual policy, right? And all of this is taking place still under the purview of the fact that the Biden administration, regardless of the United Nations, has the ability to apply immense pressure on Israel to stop what they're doing. You don't necessarily need a United Nations Security Council resolution to apply that pressure. That does help if you were, being good faith about it and you actually agreed to an immediate unconditional ceasefire. That would help. But the Biden administration could cut off weapons. The Biden administration could come out and apply public pressure to Israel, right? The UN aspect of this is a major part of it, but it's not the entirety of it. Meanwhile, the Biden administration has been sending upwards of over 100, secret under-the-table weapon shipments to Israel to continue doing exactly what they're doing. So it's not as if, he doesn't have any leverage. I mean, showing concern as you're not using any leverage that you have at your disposal whatsoever to actually force Israel to stop the invasion of Rafah. I mean, that says everything, right? Now, he finishes off here. He says, note that during the Security Council debate, U.S. Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield made a critical statement saying if Russia put forward a resolution that does not support the diplomacy on the ground, meaning the U.S.-led negotiations, that is the diplomatic process co-led by the United Nations or the United States, the council will remain deadlocked. Okay, so what they're effectively admitting here is if any other country puts forward a UNSC resolution that does not explicitly and unequivocally endorse the Biden administration's approach to negotiations for a temporary ceasefire in Gaza, then the U.S. is not going to support it. So what does that tell you? I mean, it's pretty obvious what it tells you. The United States is unwilling to stop blocking these UNSC resolutions that actually call for an immediate ceasefire. And so, guys, I mean, listen, in the next couple of days, we're probably going to have another vote, okay, on an immediate ceasefire. And this narrative that the United States is pro-ceasefire and Russia and China and Algeria are anti-ceasefire is going to completely dissolve in a couple of days. So I want you guys to know, if you have the opportunity, if you happen to be watching cable news, which I don't suggest, if you happen to be looking at mainstream sources, I want you guys to know the kind of language that they're using right now, framing this as Joe Biden and his administration are aggressively pro-peace and it's just the Chinese and the Russians who are standing against the prospects of a ceasefire right now. Note that language, because a couple of days from now, there's going to be another resolution that is calling for an unequivocal, unconditional ceasefire in Gaza. And the United States is going to come out and they're going to reject that ceasefire. So I promise you guys this is what's going to happen. And this narrative, again, is going to be completely dissolved in just a matter of days. So I don't know if this is more of a domestic political ploy from the Biden administration to say, look, we were pushing for a ceasefire, but I think that anybody who's actually reading the language, who understands the language of previous UN Security Council resolutions calling for a ceasefire, anybody who is looking at this in an honest way cannot possibly come away with the conclusion that it's the Biden administration that's trying to push for a legitimate, lasting, permanent ceasefire, and it's these other countries that are blocking it. That is not what's happening right now. This is effectively a giant virtue signal from the United States to try to shift the blame away from the fact that over the last 6 months, the Biden administration and the United States at the UNSC has been the primary blockade to end Israel's genocidal war on the people of Gaza.